Welcome back, students, to part 2 of this presentation. As mentioned in part 1 of this presentation, when the Civil War ended, racism did not simply just end. Instead, it changed forms. Instead of slavery, white communities used new ways to keep the black population under their dominance. For example, the sharecropping system was one way in which freed slaves experienced a new type of control or slavery. Even though black people were no longer slaves, they could not find jobs. They had no land that they owned to farm. They had no money with which to start their own businesses. At this time, former white plantation or farm owners rented land to black people, but black people often had to pay high prices to rent the land or use the equipment to grow crops. Often, at the end of a year of farming, some black sharecroppers actually owed the white farmers more than what they earned from their crops, putting them into debt and essentially back into a new type of slavery to white landowners or former slave owners. Even though black people were technically free from slavery and had all the rights of U.S. citizens, they were still limited by new laws called Black Codes, or later what were called Jim Crow laws. For example, even though they had the right to vote, Jim Crow laws made the ability to vote very limited. There were literacy tests, or poll taxes. Poll taxes were fees that people had to pay in order to vote. And poor black families were again limited. The literacy tests limited many former slaves from being able to vote since they had been denied an education during slavery. Often, if black people tried to vote, they were intimidated and threatened. This limited their power in choosing government representation that would work for them. These Jim Crow laws also separated black and white communities from one another through segregation laws. For example, black people were not allowed to use the same forms of transportation as white people and were even restricted from using public facilities. Everything became segregated. Restaurants, bathrooms, movie theaters, swimming pools, and even visiting days at prisons. Buses were also segregated. African Americans were made to sit in the back. Drinking fountains were separate. Now, take a moment and notice the drinking fountains in this photo. Many Jim Crow law supporters said that segregation was acceptable because while things were separate, they were still equal. Look again at the drinking fountains. Are they equal? All of these laws and segregation were continually reinforced through violence and intimidation. Groups such as the KKK, which stands for the Ku Klux Klan, is a white supremacist group started solely to terrorize African Americans in the event that they tried to vote, desegregate, or achieve a better life for themselves and their families. Groups like the KKK would often intimidate black communities through a practice called lynching, in which they would kidnap black people from their homes and murder them. However, some resisted the segregation. Rosa Parks was a woman who refused to sit in the back of a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Her arrest in 1955 led to a boycott of buses by the black community for over a year. Without African American riders, the bus company almost went out of business and then agreed to desegregate its buses. Education was also strictly segregated. Look at these two school classrooms. They are separate. They are also not equal. Many schools for black children lacked books and usable or comfortable facilities. These inequalities led to a very important Supreme Court decision in the United States in 1954. It was the Brown versus Topeka Board of Education. This court decision made segregation an unconstitutional practice. Schools and other facilities had to desegregate, but unfortunately, change did not come quickly or easily with regard to matters of race in the United States. It would be years before schools desegregated, and this is where the story of the Little Rock Nine and Warriors Don't Cry begins. Watch the next presentation to learn more.